Our lesson this coming Sunday, May the 22nd, is entitled, Redeemed from an Unbelieving Past. And we're going to be looking now at just one passage of Scripture. Several of our lessons have been from 2 or 3 different chapters, but we're going to concentrate now on Acts 26, verses 9 through 20. Now it's important, and I try to point this out very briefly in the introduction, that we kind of understand the background now of this particular passage of Scripture, because Paul is going to be speaking now to the great-grandson of Herod the Great. Let me repeat that. The great-grandson of Herod the Great. He's called Agrippa, or Agrippa II. And so he will come down to the city of Caesarea, where Paul was kept for about 2 years. Let me go back just for a moment, if you will, please, Sunday school teacher. We think that Paul was born somewhere around 1 AD, no later than about 10 AD, converted somewhere perhaps around between 30 and 35 AD. And after his conversion on the Damascus Road, well, then he spent some time back in Tarsus, then comes around and makes 3 missionary journeys, is what he does. And toward the end of that 3rd journey, which he's been taking a love offering, he takes that offering now to the needy Christians in Jerusalem, and they accused him, his enemies did, of taking some Gentiles into the innermost court. Now, Gentiles could go into the outer court of the temple area, but there was another little wall right around the temple building you could not take Gentiles into, or Gentiles couldn't go. And they accused Paul of taking these Gentiles in there. A mob broke out, and Paul was rescued and taken all the way from Jerusalem down to the city of Caesarea. He's going to be in prison there for about 2 years. I date those years about 58, 59, and 60, somewhere right in there, then before he goes to Rome, then at the end of that. But while he's there, he's before 2 procurators called Felix and Festus. And then the great-grandson of Herod the Great comes. In your New Testament, you have 4 generations of Herod, somewhat confusing now to some people. Herod the Great tried to kill Jesus when Jesus was an infant. Herod Antipas is the Herod before whom Jesus appeared on Friday morning when Pilate sent him over to Herod. Well, that was Herod Antipas, the son of Herod the Great. The 3rd generation, then the grandson of Herod the Great, then is in Acts 12, and he killed James the apostle, and that's called Agrippa. He was called Agrippa. And the 4th generation is this Agrippa here now in Acts 26. So this is the great-grandson of Herod the Great, is who we're talking about here. And they're in the city of Caesarea. Herod the Great made it one of the greatest cities in the Mediterranean world. Built the first artificial harbor in the history of the human race, out about a mile wide, out into the sea to protect it against the waves in the wintertime. Made it and built a huge temple to Augustus, the worship of Augustus Caesar and everything. And that was the official headquarters of the procurators, and Paul is there. And while he's there then, well, this great-grandson of Herod the Great comes down, and Festus, then the procurator, wants him because Agrippa II has some Jewish background. And Paul will speak to that. So our lesson focuses on Paul's testimony to Agrippa. Herod Agrippa, the great-grandson here, and he's in Caesarea when he makes this particular thing. I heard a professor years ago who thinks maybe the 4 prison epistles, Galatians, Ephesians, Philippians, and Philemon, were written here, but I don't think so. I think they were written later from Rome. But Paul was here in Caesarea for 2 years. I think that's the time that Luke went from Caesarea 70 miles to Jerusalem, interviewed Mary, and got the most intimate details in the Bible about the virgin birth. All that information about the angel Gabriel coming and talking to her in Nazareth are in the Gospel of Luke, and I think Luke got that from Mary. He had 2 years when, as a busy medical doctor, he had a little free time with Paul in prison. So I think that's when Luke did his research and got his information to write his Gospel, during that 2 years. But anyway, during that year, now he appears before him, and so there are 3 main parts of your lesson. First, let's look at verses 9, 10, and 11. And Paul is testifying now to this great-grandson and how that he at one time was an enemy of Christianity. He mentions that he tried to harm them and hurt them and everybody who believed in Jesus. He persecuted them, he says in verse 10, shutting them up in prisons. And he had the authority of the high priest even to kill them, if necessary, that way. He persecuted them, and the synagogue compelled them to blaspheme, whatnot like that. So verses 9, 10, and 11, Paul is telling now Herod Agrippa II how at one time he was a bitter, bitter enemy of Christianity. The second part of the lesson then tells about going to Damascus to hunt down the Christians. Well, we have a record of this also earlier, see, in the book of Acts. So Luke tells us about this. But here, Luke is recording Paul's testimony to King Agrippa. So he says how that he was going to Damascus to persecute the Christians when a bright light. Well, we have a record of that also in the book of Acts. Then he talks about hearing this voice, And then how the voice was that of Jesus, who identified himself. Who art thou, Lord? And Jesus says, I am Jesus whom you're persecuting. Well, Paul wasn't persecuting Jesus personally. He was persecuting his followers. But Jesus, who identifies with his followers that persecute them, is the same as persecuting Christ. But that's what he says then in this way. And then Jesus says to them a very important thing, and Paul repeats that now. And I want to read that for you because it has a word that's very, very important to us now then in this way. And he tells King Agrippa that he was not then disobedient to the voice that came